think maybe I can start it off here.
Sure, Daniel.
So my name is Daniel Christian. I'm a EXP commercial agent from California. I just switched over from the realty side. So I'm looking into business brokering because I have a friend in Oklahoma that owns a business since 2015, and he's considering selling it during the next expansion period. So
Okay.
he's done pretty well for himself. I'll give you one little nugget. He stole Berkshire Hathaway's accountant. So, and she's been with him for several years now. And so it's an opportunity for me, but, I just kind of want to, see what, kind of get some highlights on what some of the most important things are to consider when factoring. Is it based on a pro forma? Is it like what type of financial models, what type of underwriting? Like I have a ton of questions, so I don't know if that gets any juices flowing.
All right. Well, a couple things. First off, Oklahoma is a non-licensed state, meaning you don't have to have a license to sell a business in Oklahoma, which means since you're in California, you are absolutely free to sell a business in Oklahoma. There's nothing that's going to bar you from doing that. Okay. Second, in terms of business valuations, every business is unique and businesses are valued on their own merits. And typically buyers buy businesses based on perceived risk. So the way that they assess that perceived risk oftentimes is by looking at the historical financials. You're generally going to need 3 to 5 years of historical tax returns, P&Ls, balance sheets, depending on the type of business. Buyers come in different sizes, shapes, and models, right? So there are different types of buyers. You have your individuals and entrepreneurs who are looking for small businesses. You also have private equity firms that are doing roll-ups or family offices. You've got search funds. You've got guys coming out of Yale or Harvard or, Wharton School of Business, and they want to be CEOs. So they get some investors to back them, and they go out and they buy businesses that are in the $5 to $10 million range. So there's all kinds of different buyers. And one of the jobs of a business broker is to find out what are the seller's objectives? What is important to the seller? Because it's not always money. Money's a factor, but that's not always a first priority. Sometimes it's really important for the seller to make sure that the business does not end up being relocated. It's in the community. It's been in the community for 25 or 30 or 40 years. Some of the employees have been with the business for 20 or 25 or 30 years. And maybe the business owner, maybe the business has been supporting Little League and other community events. And it's really important to the seller. That legacy for the business is important to the seller. So the seller wants to make sure that whoever buys the business is going to continue supporting the Little League, continue, employing those employees that have been there 25, 30 years because it supports their families. Just continue with all of that. So sometimes that is far more important than money to a seller. So one of the things as a business broker, one of the first things you have to do is find out what are the seller's objectives. Is the seller looking for top dollar and doesn't care who the buyer is? Is the seller, is the legacy more important to the seller? And he wants it to be a local entrepreneur or individual, or maybe in-house, maybe a key employee or a key employee group that takes over that business. What are the things that are important to the seller? Let's see. Valuation, again, you're going to go with the historical financials, but there's also risk factors that come into play. For example, if you have a business that's got 10 employees, but 4 of them are not authorized to work in the United States, then that becomes a problem because now your buyer has to either replace 40% of the workers, 40% of staff, or the buyer has to take on that risk. Well, if the buyer is going to take on that risk, they're certainly not going to pay top dollar to do it, right? So the higher the perceived risk, the lower the value to a buyer. So anything you identify in terms of risk factors Another big risk factor is owner centricity. So if the business starts and stops with the owner is the sole decision maker, the majority of the processes and procedures are in the owner's head and not documented, or the owner is the sole person bringing in business development, all of that means that when the owner walks out the door, the majority of the business walks out the door with him, and you have very little transferable value. So when you're talking about business valuation, it's not just the value of the business with the owner there, it's really the transferable value that we're looking at. And what is the value of the business without the owner there? What is the value that transfers over to a buyer? Does that make sense? All right, one other thing I can tell you about business brokerage is I've had people come to me and say, I got into residential. I didn't like it. It's way too emotional. I don't like these people that deal, this high emotional stuff. So that's why I transferred over to commercial. And what I tell them is great, because in this world, you need to think about a three-legged stool where you have residential, you have commercial, and you have business brokerage. A business brokerage is not commercial. They're two very different animals. And what I can tell you about business brokerage is if you don't like the emotional stuff, stay out, because sellers are very emotional, very attached to their businesses. Their business is like a child to them. And just like you wouldn't walk up to somebody and say, hey, your baby is ugly, you can't go to a business owner and say, hey, your business is really jacked up. This is so you have to be most sellers have an overly inflated value of what they think their business is worth because they try to convert blood, sweat, and tears into dollars. And their 20 or 30 or 40 years of work in the business does not, it just doesn't convert to dollars and cents very easily. Because like I said, buyers are looking at what the future holds. They're looking at what the business is going to do for them. And the way that they assess that is largely by looking at what the business financials or what the business has done financially over the last 3 to 5 years. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Anybody want to add to that? I know some of you guys have some good experience. So
I totally agree with you on the emotions, Daniel. I do both commercial and business brokering, but I'm also a broker on the residential side. And she's absolutely right. You got to hold it together. It's a lot of coaching and consulting and counseling, and because you're treading fine lines with them. They also don't always tell you the true thing at the front. So you really have to dig deep. I just did a coaching consult call this morning to coach a company, and she had said, I don't want to exit for 10 years if ever. But while we were talking this morning with her husband in the room, she's like, well, maybe 2. Now we're talking franchising. So it's like you got to roll with it. You got to roll with it, and you really have to dig deep because there's always more behind it than what they're telling you up front, because they don't really want you to know up front everything.
Yep, absolutely. All right, Daniel, did I hit on, there was kind of a lot to unpack there, so I'm not sure that I'm sure you probably have some other questions. Feel free to fire away.
Yeah, so you did answer quite a few of my questions. So in my particular, I'm just kind of going off my particular situation, what's, my current book of business. So I can tell you that one of the things that is a concern are the standards and operating procedures moving over. My seller wants to remain in the business. So it's like a sale leaseback essentially, right?
Sure.
So, I guess, how does that work with, bringing on a new owner? Obviously there needs to be an employment contract at that point in time, right? If they're going to remain as an operator in the business.
So what type of business is this?
It's pipeline welding inspection.
Okay, pipeline welding inspection. And how many employees are there?
So it depends on the project. He does have MSAs with several clients, but it can vary from, I think the least that he's had on a job was 13 all the way up to like 40.
Okay.
So it does fluctuate considerably depending on the project.
Anya, when you look at that, would you consider those employees or just 1099 like tactical project people? How would you look at that?
I know that the employees are paid on payroll. They're on payroll. So I
Yeah,
don't,
but for
I'm
the
not
sake of the valuation, it changes. So for curious to know how she would
Well, I would look at them as employees. I mean,
do it.
as far as how they're paid. Um, yeah, I would look at them as employees, and it is common in certain industries for the number of employees to fluctuate. And in a lot of states, having fluctuating number of employees is not really a big deal. California, it is because our labor laws are so ridiculous. But in a lot of states, you can have fluctuating employment numbers and without having any serious detriment to the
Cool.
business. All right. So in terms of this, first of all, I don't know the size of the business. I don't know what their gross revenue is, and I don't want to make any assumptions here, but I can tell you a couple of things depending on the buyer. Okay. So if your buyer is an individual or an entrepreneur and the business is a size, let's say under $10 million. Okay. If the business sells for under $10 million, let's say under 8, then probably you have a buyer who is going to be looking to get an SBA loan. SBA loans go up to $5 million. And then above that, you can work with a couple of different banks that have what they call a pari passu, which basically is another commercial loan that is equivalent to or set up and designed to work with SBA loans. So it'd be 10 years in length and roughly around the same type of interest rate. And so with a pari passu, the combination of an SBA loan with a pari passu can usually get you a loan amount of up to about $8 million. So if the buyer is putting down another, let's say, 10% is usually what they need to put down. So let's say they're putting down $1 million, and you've got a $9 million business covered there. Okay. That being said, SBA does not allow the seller to be an owner, or I'm sorry, to be an employee of the new owner. So a seller, unless it's a stock sale, and they just changed that in the most recent SOP that came out, I think, in November. So under a stock sale, they will allow an employment agreement, but otherwise, no. And most businesses are going to transfer under an asset purchase agreement. So assuming this transfers under an asset purchase agreement, then the seller can stay on as a consultant for up to a year. There's a transition period that's typically any, 4 to 6 weeks, maybe longer, depending on the business. I have one right now where sellers agreed to be, to stay on for up to 6 months. But that's on a consulting, well, free, included in the price of the business. Anything after that is on a consulting agreement that's agreed to between the parties. But just understand that under the SBA guidelines, the buyer cannot be an employee, can only be a consultant. So now that's if it's the buyer's an individual or entrepreneur. Now, if you have a buyer that turns out to be a private equity firm, that's a whole different situation. They are going to use private money. They might get a commercial loan, but it's not going to be SBA. So they don't have to worry about that. And a lot of times private equity will want an owner to stay on. Certain private equity groups will want an owner to stay on for up to 3 years. And so a private equity firm or a family office may be a better fit for this. But again, it depends on the size of the business. It depends on the cash flow, because private equity is probably not going to be interested if the cash flow is not, if they're doing a roll up, or something, and the cash flow is above 250 or 300,000, it might work as an add-on for a platform company they already have. But if they're looking at it as a platform company, then it needs to have 2 million or 3 million in EBITDA.